Yeah, no, and that's a good question because we're going to see a lot of graphs in today's session. So I want to talk a little bit about where those numbers are coming from. And as I mentioned before, most of this is derived from our D4 cases. So this is an instance where Kroll has been engaged in some capacity. There is some kind of incident for an organization, either they're either calling us in to validate or triage what may be suspicious activity, or there is a full-blown cyber attack such as ransomware encryption, and they're calling us to come in and to respond to that. Now what we do is we look at that data on a monthly basis. We also look at it on a quarterly basis, which is what we're going to be going over today. And it is really a view of what we're seeing, right? So it's people who have called Kroll and engaged us, but we try to overlay that with what we're seeing in the broader industry. So we're also comparing our data against OSINT and other security research reporting. We're also comparing it with what we're seeing on the dark web that threat actors are talking about, and that's kind of how we develop the quarterly session every time and build out the themes that we'll be talking about a little bit more at length today. So let's get into some of the numbers here. We're going to start out looking specifically at sector, and I know we're going to get to the education sector, but first we're going to look at a broad, kind of like the broad spectrum of what we were seeing with sector targeting in the second quarter of this year. And no surprise, professional services was again the top firm that we were seeing in our cases here at Kroll. And professional services, that encompasses a lot of different entities. This could be law firms, accounting firms, business services firms. We also continue to see manufacturing coming in at second of the targeted industries, and financial services is also on that list. We did have a jump this particular quarter in healthcare, so it went up from about it went up by about 5 percentage points from Q1. And looking in those healthcare cases, a lot of what we're seeing impacting them was email compromise, as well as ransomware, particularly by the Lockbit group, Inc. ransomware, and we also did see some relation to the healthcare sector and fog ransomware, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in this particular section. So, we specifically called out education though, so I want to look a little bit more at education and some of the trends that we see with that sector, because even though it didn't make our top 5 for this time, we did observe an increase from the last quarter. And it's interesting to note that we tend to see these seasonal increases associated with education sector. So you can see in 2023 we saw an increase in activity around Q2 and Q3. Then we see a little less usually in like Q4, Q1, and then typically if our predictions are right for this year, we're going to see another spike in activity in Q3. And based on some of the cases that we've had incoming, I think that is likely. And it's likely that this kind of seasonal ebb and flow is definitely related to the fact that threat actors may be, looking at education as more of an attractive sector in the summer months, those times when there is a lot of transition, right? End of school, back to school, because they may be expecting, first of all, they may be more likely to pay some kind of a ransom during those peak times because they need access to services. And it could also be a belief that there's a perceived reduction in IT staffing during those summer months, so some kind of infection might go unnoticed and allow that to be a more impactful event. So let's look specifically at the next slide. We're going to look at some of the threat incident types that are targeting the education sector. And obviously we started out and we're going to be talking about fog ransomware today. So we saw actually, number 1 for education sector was email compromise, followed by ransomware. And I kind of want to compare that to what we were seeing across all sectors, right? So the numbers on the left here are just the education sector. And then if we look over at the numbers on the right of this slide, this is all sectors. So, when we compare the education sector to all sectors, you can see that ransomware is a little higher than average. Like on average, we have about 18% of ransomware across sectors, and we see about 29% incident with education clients. Same thing with unauthorized access. That one is also a little elevated compared to the all sectors look. And malware is a really interesting one here, because malware in general across all sectors, it doesn't even really, it's very low on our percentages across all sectors. But if we look just at the education sector, it actually counts for 7% of what we see. So those might be cases, and we're going to get really into this later in George's section, but those are usually cases where, it's some kind of malware on the network, but it hasn't progressed to, maybe like a full-blown ransomware incident where we have evidence of encryption and exfiltration. So let's look at our next slide here, and we're going to get into so how are actors getting into education organizations. And then in Q2, the most common way that we were seeing was actually, according to the numbers, it comes out as CVE exploitation. And a lot of this 38% here was related to the Pan OS CVE, which we're going to talk about later in the presentation. And most of those were what we would call, I think we would classify those as kind of level 0 or level 1s, where there was some kind of access, but we didn't actually see the access progress to something worse or some kind of an incident on the system. So it was kind of stopped before it progressed to anything. So that was what we were seeing. So that's why that number is a little higher than normal. But I want to look over here on the right side of the graph. If we look at drive-by, external remote services, and valid accounts, each of those on their own account for about 13%, but when you add those three up, it accounts to 39%. So it's actually higher than CVE. And why that is important is what we're going to cover in the next section here. Because one of the things that's driving valid accounts, and one of the things that people get infected with a drive-by compromise is something we call information stealing malware. And that is a problem that we see across all sectors, but we're particularly seeing a lot of it with the education sector. And those credentials that are stolen through that, they can be used to help with basically all three of those initial access methods.